In a land now forgotten by time and men, there is a legend of a crystal with inconceivable powers. Bequeathed from father to son for countless generations, it brings prosperity and joy to the entire realm. Unfortunately, in return it claims the lives of those who possess it. Rodolphus lay reclining on his comfortable tilting throne, unconsciously staring at three large, thick brown-furred blowflies chasing each other joyously among the burning flashlights fixed to the wall of the great royal hall. One of them, perhaps the most daring, as he was about to grasp with his mighty chitinous mandibles the hind leg of his companion, who was flying just ahead of him, twirled in on himself several times, perhaps to add pathos to the already truly dramatic scene, but inadvertently came too close to a tongue of fire that in an instant lapped him. Instants later, amid the hushed giggles of his two erstwhile buddies, the bold furred blowfly died out alone in a corner, crackling merrily. The weary king, in thrusting out his potbelly, shifted his center of gravity beyond the point of balance, and the throne began to rock and squeak. As he rhythmically contracted and expanded his bulging abdomen, he rejoiced and congratulated himself on his resourcefulness. The tilting throne had cost him a fortune, but it worked perfectly. Large inlaid planks of cedar, fastened to the ground by burnished bronze pegs, held an alabaster sphere in which a niche carpeted with albino cougar skins had been carved. An intricate system of jacks and hidden ropes allowed the whole thing to swing from a state of secure stillness to another of heady, soft dynamism. Like the roar produced by lightning crashing mightily on a 1,000-year-old oak tree and reducing it into a pile of red smoldering embers, so suddenly the pewter trumpets on the outside announced the time for the royal bath. The last notes were still echoing in the thick air when Rodolphus, conscious of his position, pressed a switch hidden beneath the cougar skins, and the heavy coral-clad ebony doors of the great throne room opened like the greedy mouth of a monster. A dull roar in the distance broke the flat silence, and a split second later, an avalanche of brackish water thunderously flooded the half-darkened room. Spurts of froth softly reached Rodolphus's neck, forehead, and roughly all of his naked parts, as the floor yielded to the immense fury of the water column tilting dangerously. From the safety of his tilting throne, the motionless king watched the seething waters rush, mugging into the chasm hidden beneath the floor. With the pressure diminished, the latter realigned itself to the chromium-plated steps arranged radially on the walls, and the neat, cool royal hall regained its stillness. At that point, dozens of maidservants in garish robes of fragrant silk made their appearance, emerging from crevices hidden by thick tapestries embroidered with gold. The handmaids held jars of scented oils, fine fabrics, marble sticks, watermelon slices, and vanadium cages filled with white, soft-haired jackrabbits. A long, loud, overly bombastic thunderclap, followed by a gasp and a sigh of smug satisfaction, staggered the women, who immediately whitened their faces despite being in a sense accustomed to it. The walls, which were as thick as 60 donkey backs lined up in a row, quivered as some modestly sized sandstone blocks fell from the vault, shattering to the ground and sowing panic. The bewildered eyes of the handmaiden carrying a bowl filled with steamed kidney beans met those of Rodolphus while an embarrassed expression was being painted on the latter's face. The niche in which he sat also served as a sounding board, and for this reason it was sometimes difficult for him to hide some of his spontaneous expressions. The young handmaiden, at first petrified, then resolute, turned on her elk-horn heels and disappeared into the shadows of the colonnade. The other women broke the awkward silence with dulcet songs, sprinkling every square meter of the room with large quantities of balms, perfumes, and spices. Nevertheless, the air had become rather heavy. "Calicles has come," proclaimed a page, bursting with a broken breath into Rodolphus's presence. "Calicles has come to court with his 100 daughters, with brightly painted hips, sire," then continued the kneeling messenger between drops of sweat. The silence in the royal hall was almost as unbearable as the smell. "He presents as gifts the following wares: 100 wineskins of sour cream, 50 measures of elm bark macerated in as many measures of bergamot juice, 10 feet of iridescent gauze, 2 chests of Duke Father's discarded clothes, a necklace of mountain thrush legs, half a basket of pecorino cheese, 2 fingers of mead, 5 peach nut stones, the end of an ibex horn, and a tuft of mixed pubic hair concluded the page in one breath. Rodolphus tossed discontentedly on the still damp cougar skins, while Geralda, his favorite slave, combed his thick eyebrows with a comb made of faux polar bear bone. "Bring in Calicles. Before, though, let the wise Dadriel join me immediately," exclaimed the king, pushing the uglier handmaids away from him. Some among the remaining handmaids inserted large marble sticks, which they were barely holding, into as many holes in the walls. A dull click followed the end of the stroke. When all the marble rods were in place, the thick curtains that covered the magnificent vaulting of the royal hall snapped back into special alcoves distributed among the supporting joists, uncovering pricelessly beautiful frescoes depicting scenes of hunting and lake fishing. A mighty club-bearer, clad in an armor of iridescent shells of murex snails, scampered his way through the chubby bunnies that had sprung out of their vanadium cages, and, after extracting 2 amber bars from who knows where, began rubbing them together with great effort until his temporal veins swelled alarmingly. A cascade of bluish sparks fell into the great brazier filled with brushwood and rosewood roots. After a blink of an eye, the great royal hall glowed proudly with 1,000 shades of yellow. It seemed as if the sun itself had descended within those walls. An intricate system of telescopic mirrors and prismatic lenses channeled a golden beam of light right into the figure of Rodolphus, thus making him resemble the immortal gods. Dark reflections clouded the king's mind as he played with Mogo, his fortune hamster. Why on earth had Calicles gone all the way to the outer isles with a caravan of women and gifts? What request would he bring to the attention of his admirable and eclectic person? Dadriel made his triumphant entrance from a trap door in the ceiling. He fell, dead weight, whistling from a height of about 42 feet onto a crudely woven wicker basket, and something in the minds of the assembled changed. The sage could read the thoughts of others. He would creep within the brain-folded cortex volutes like a snake and lay listening. He had been Rodolphus's mentor since Bertolf, his father, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances while shaving his legs with a pumice stone in the palace's grand sauna. A few months later, when it was certain that Bertolf would never return, Rodolphus was appointed king, and the wise Dadriel handed over to him on that occasion the warm magic crystal, now the target of Calicles' greed, enjoining him never to part with it, since that, if kept in close contact with the royal epidermis, would bring prosperity and joy to the entire realm, without even the effort of having to undertake the slightest legal or juridical regulatory activity against anyone. It would also have single-handedly kept Keynesian macroeconomic variables in check by ensuring steady growth in gross domestic product, high employment, and a lower unemployment rate than any competing state, without stifling the flow of import-export for that matter. To make sure he never broke the epidermal conjunction with the amulet, Rodolphus had the tilting throne built from which he never left. "I will be vigilant," Rodolphus said in a huff after much thought. "I will order my guards to stand ready at my nod in case of jeopardy." Chapter 2. Calicles fiddled nervously with the porcupine-shaped ring he wore hanging from his nostril while lying on a bench in the atrium. He wondered why he was waiting so long. The mighty ebony doors, covered with coral bas-reliefs, were manned by 2 huge guards armed with heavy halberds, whose gaze, lost in the void, suggested that they surely had not been trained to stand in that position for hours, and that if the king did not make up his mind to welcome the guests, they would collapse to the ground from a sugar crash, throwing the whole garrison into ridicule. A gentle breeze caressed the castle walls, bringing with it the shrill cries of some small birds with iridescent feathers fluttering merrily in the clear air. But in the distance, large black clouds laden with rain hinted that a furious gathering storm was soon to come. "My master," whispered a servant dressed in fine clothes in Calicles' ear, "the ice sculptures are melting and one of the dancers has escaped from the group seeking political asylum. If Rodolphus does not let us in right away, I no longer guarantee the success of the show. He finished huffing and wrinkling his nose. Calicles did not even have time to break his neck that already the king's trumpeters were announcing the opening of the portal, blowing on the ringing pewter trumpets. The caravan of the emperor of the reared heaths poured into the royal hall like a flooding river while maintaining strict silence. The feather-adorned dancers arranged themselves next to each other by the large brazier, jingling the copper bells they had attached to their toes. The 100 daughters of Calicles, concealed by thick black veils, sat in the back near the chrome stops that held up the floor, still and silent on a row of soft cushions arranged beforehand for the purpose by the strong eunuch servants. The gifts on display were laid here and there in a choreographed manner. Rodolphus now carefully observed his courtiers trembling. Daedril, who was standing to his right holding a bejeweled rod, approached him worriedly. "They're all thinking about a quiet body of water," Daedril blew in a grave voice. "I can't perceive any other thought, which is strange." A roll of drums interrupted the conversation between the two, and soon after, the mighty figure of Calicles stood out against the backlight between the open doors. "Uno, dos, tres," shouted the emperor from afar. "Bela, bela, bela, Calicles is here." The dancers began stomping along at a rapid pace, with a characteristic break on the third beat as the feathers covering them rustled rhythmically, and the bells at their feet filled the room with auburn tones. Abandoning their lineup, amid howls worthy of castrated ferrets and deliberately mischievous leaps, the dancers whirled with an alternating motion between centripetal and centrifugal, preferring the latter. However, until they formed a rounded square with flanged, vibrant edges. Calicles still standing upright at the climax of concentration, so much so that a trickle of blood flowed out of his right nostril, raised his arms in a jerk showing his back-combed armpits. Eyes were all on him, with a united and tense handstand of momentum, dived into a head fold forward, followed deliciously by a rollover, with a diving return and a backward flip. The pace was relentless, and everyone's attention was magnetized to the emperor of the reared heaths, who, after a screaming double unjambi and a handless freewheel, ended his performance with a flick-flack rondata to leave even the most demanding ringmasters enraptured. The jingling of the bells ceased, and Rodolphus, almost moved by such bravura, was about to say something when Daedril disentangled himself from his side. With a solemn gait, the old man advanced amid the silence of the onlookers until he brought his admirable, bejeweled rod to within a few centimeters of Calicles' sweaty body, who was still catching his breath, breathing as a bellow. "I didn't expect a two-step interlude, I must give you that," hissed the sage angrily. "But in vaulting, my dear, passing your legs first, then detaching your hands, though I recognize it to be a circus primacy, you have shown me that you are not what you want us to believe. I had thought you were far cleverer, but I have been on to you. There is not only a quiet pool of water in your thoughts." Calicles gave a stymied nod, and the dancers disappeared into the shadows, chirping and jingling. The emperor stood in all his magnificence. Golden curls, shamefully greased with marten oil for seafaring use, fell like a rushing, filthy cascade over his bare shoulders, sadistically historiated with tattoos of glyphs and superstitious symbols. A bunting composed of articulated slats bandaged his badass abdomen, while zebra-striped stockings winked under thigh braces, also composed of bronze gills. On his feet he wore rounded ox-snout shoes, embellished with short mother-of-pearl spurs. The hairy chest of the master of the four deserts swelled overbearingly as his upper lip arched, leaving sharp white fangs exposed. An electric vibe was in the air, and the electrostatic charges that sympathetically whirled in the throne room made the hairs on Rodolphus's back sizzle. "Had you thought that the venerable Daedril was so foolish as not to expect anything more than a mere courtesy visit from a notorious desert marauder?" roared the sage, and with an accusing manner added, "You want the crystal, don't you? Speak now, or forever hold your peace." "I've never tolerated arrogant people, except for myself, that is," proclaimed Calicles in a deep voice, as with an unexpected backhand he forever stamped the mark of his ring on the cheek of Daedril, who in response spat out a pair of premolars. "Imprison the stranger," shouted Rodolphus at the top of his lungs. "It's too late now, you big belly," taunted Calicles, with such fractiousness that the dancers hidden in the shadows of the colonnade quivered with delight, and a subdued peal accompanied the emperor's icy glance as he gave his people the order to act. The 100 figures seated near the chrome-plated stops that held up the floor of the great throne room, and who had remained relatively motionless up to that point, stood up abruptly, freeing themselves from the heavy black veils. It seemed as if hell itself had given birth to those creatures with hideous features. "No, this can't be true," gasped Rodolphus, cowering between the soft cougar skins. "These are not women with tender, buttery forms, but bloodthirsty soldier demons." Calicles would have liked to add, like the good sadist he was, a joke of mockery to further mortify the valiant inventor of the tilting throne, when his jaw stopped halfway and his field of vision was filled with obnoxious colored dots. A dumb laugh grew in intensity in his brain swirls, causing him to falter. Even the vile beings surrounding the room froze, bringing their hands to their ears, or whatever they were. "Nice slap, boy," rustled Daedril, holding trembly to the bejeweled rod. "Your hand was quicker than thought. But as I told you before, I had already exposed your intentions. Now, look what happens to your little creatures." One by one, the 100 soldier demons sagged to the ground smoothly as the smell of fried brains wafted through the hall. "Stop!" cried Geralda, the king's favorite handmaiden. "If you twist even a hair in Calicles, I will thrust into Rodolphus's flaccid belly this dagger soaked in venomous concoctions of my own invention." Unfortunately, Daedril did not stay put. Epilogue. The sky was dreary and Glodberg bells rattled the pungent air, jerking the storks that flew high to avoid scraping their bellies on the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the imposing Mount Stradmore. Huddled in front of the lively flames of the fireplace, sipping cups of broth from those storks who had inadvertently underestimated the sharp peaks, patrons of the tavern, Gundagoot's warm embrace, chatted softly as they followed the dance of the shadows that snaked between the smoky beams of the ceiling. Quite unexpectedly, the tavern door swung open, and whirling on its rusty hinges, went crashing against the moldy wall, causing a shower of rubble to fall on the distraught silhouette that burst into the room in stride. "Thymer, what manners are these?" blurts out the innkeeper angrily. "That maple door and that mold effect on the walls cost me a fortune." "Forgive me, Gundagoot," countered the man. "What I saw just now put so much fear in my body that I couldn't wait to hole up somewhere safe." The patrons were stunned in their filthy raffia dresses. Gundagoot limped over to the bench where Thymer had slumped, grudgingly, handing him a mug of fermented porridge. In the thick silence of the tavern, only muffled burps and subdued farts could be heard. Thymer quenched his thirst noisily and then wiped off with the back of his hand the patches of oatmeal that soaked his tawny beard. "I was hollowing out turnips from my garden," said Thymer, "when I heard an icy whisper defile my oracle. I turned sharply and was confronted by a diaphanous form with the likeness of my cousin Gelter. Guys, everyone knows he had a stroke. In the place where they found his body, there are people still laughing. Gelter, however, was deadly serious and looked at me with those ectoplasmic pig eyes. We remained silent for a long time, and only after my urine had stopped running down my leg did I ask him in a trembling voice what he wanted, almost metabolizing that I was looking at a ghost. Gundagoot shifted his weight from the rosewood leg to the good one. He had never been a good listener. He had already been lost on the turnip thing, and now he could no longer remember why he was standing there, instead of doing anything. Since childhood, he had struggled to listen beyond the "once upon a time" of the stories his grandfather told him. Taking advantage of the pause, he mumbled between his teeth, "I don't know what excuse," and left humming as if nothing had happened. "Gelter raised a dry, smoky arm," continued Thymer, with his eyes averted as if he were speaking to himself. In his hazy fist he clutched the cursed crystal, the one from Rodolphus. He had found it rummaging through the ruins of Fleckmore Ditch. I could not believe it, but the crystal shone right in front of me. The legend is so true. My cousin gave me the crystal, and then it evaporated like morning mist. And thankfully, was the chorus of response he got from his impromptu audience, who resumed sipping the cold stork broth leaving him alone with his fears. Thymer could not understand the supreme disinterest. He had told of ghosts, legends, and crystals, essential elements of any good fantasy tale. His turnips were waiting for him, and fortunately, in telling what he had seen, he had exorcised all his fears. As he was getting up, however, ignored by everyone, he sensed that the crystal he had hung around his neck under the rough goat's wool tunic had already begun to bestow prosperity and joy on the entire realm without even the effort of having to undertake the slightest legal or legal regulatory activity against anyone, and he was happy.